recording, and we'll go full screen. You guys can see my screen okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So we had one question. Obviously, we'll go over how everyone's doing for the week first, and then we're going to get into the book club. And then, Michelle and I talk privately. She's been dealing with a friend's parent passing, so I'm going to take over her chapter for her this week. But since she's here, she knows about the chapter next week, and then hopefully I don't have to step in again because it's a lot of preparation. All right, so first and foremost, weekly check-ins. So let's go down the line. So Sheila, we were just touching on it before I saw Lisa and Michelle had logged on. So how are you doing this week?
Good. Actually, I'm feeling really good. Morgan, we got her back to school. She's feeling better, and I think that helped me get back on track then because I was kind of out of my normal routine.
Yeah, no, for sure. That sounded kind of scary that she had to be hospitalized due to those things.
Yeah.
So that's good. So yeah, you have been on track. I've seen you staying within your windows. Net carbs are good. Everything is good. So yeah, that's awesome. Michelle, how's everything going on your end? I know you had was there a slip up this week or was it last week? But you had a slip up recently, and you've been on track though since. Every day has gotten a little better.
I have been on track. Unfortunately, I am still plateaued. I talked to my doctor about it tonight though, and she feels that it's because she ordered blood tests for me and everything, but she doesn't think I'm going to find anything there. She thinks it's because I've been on and off steroids for 3 months.
Yeah.
And she's saying just because I stopped taking it doesn't mean the steroid's out of my system.
Right.
And that I just have to allow myself time. We'll check in the bloods and stuff, but she doesn't seem to think it's going to be anything with that. She thinks I just have to kind of deal with it and keep going through doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think, you weren't on just one round of steroids like a lot of people are when they're sick. You had a couple of instances the last few months. So, yeah, that could definitely mess with your hormone levels. And your hormone levels, as we've learned during our time together, are crucial to you staying on a gradual, losing track. So, yeah, aside from the weight, though, are you feeling better? Overall, are your clothes fitting better? Are you noticing other
I don't
physical
notice
changes?
any change, which is really very frustrating to me. But also, because of everything that's been going on and all the sicknesses, I have not been exercising like I was either.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure that's a huge part of it, too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping, going forward, everything will just fall into place and I can get back into my routine. But I don't notice any changes, and it is very frustrating because I feel like I'm eating very well.
You are.
And it's annoying.
Yeah. Well, tomorrow is the official day, so let's check in tomorrow and see what happens in that case. But regardless, yeah, your doctor's probably 100% on point with that. It's very common for there to be weight retention and some issues. Did she give you a guesstimate as to how long it might be before the hormone imbalances that might be as a result of that might subside and go back to normal?
No, she didn't give me any window. She just told me I should be thankful I didn't gain weight.
No, that's true. You didn't. And there were many weeks where you lost on the antibiotics.
And I told her that. I said I did lose like a pound each time I was on them. And she's like, that usually doesn't happen. People gain weight.
Yeah. Oh, it's extremely. I had a client who's great too, and she gained weight on steroids. You're the first person I've worked with who's been on steroids and not. So that's a good sign. So just, like she said, I know it seems like a slog when you're not seeing the results on the scale, you're not noticing them, but yeah, just keep going at it. Your body will correct itself, I'm sure, sooner than later. But just keep at it. You're doing all the right things, so definitely feel good about that. And then Lisa, how's everything going this week?
Well, as of Monday, good.
Oh yeah.
My parents came out east for the weekend, and it was my own fault because I planned to make foods that weren't friendly for me.
Mm-hmm.
So like pancakes, my father loves that kind of stuff. So, I was like, oh, I'm going to eat it. And I did. And listen, I wasn't as bad as I really could have been. But, and I think too, from the week before I had that stomach thing, and my stomach for a full week was really off kilter. So I kind of feel like now I'm getting back on track with everything. So my eating has been good the last, 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I feel a little bit more motivated too. So that's good.
Good.
I think my motivation, was waning. I'd have a little talk with myself.
There you go. Yeah, whatever works. Yeah, that happens to me. It happens to everybody. Yeah, eventually you just get to a point where, you've made so much progress. There's no point in looking back and undoing all the good you've done. So yeah, that's good. Every once in a while, we all intentionally self-sabotage. I wrote about that the last couple of days, and I've used other clients' real-world examples. And yeah, it's something that we all have to deal with. But yeah, you have the right mental attitude, and obviously you're right. The last few days have been good nutritionally, so just keep plowing along. And I'm glad you kind of rekindled some of that motivation, because we've gone over this too. It does wax and wane. So I'm glad that it's waxing now and not waning.
Yeah.
Because I know at the beginning of the year, that was definitely a struggle for everybody after the holidays and all that. All right. So, okay, cool. So before we get into the book stuff, I'm going to go into your questions. So Sheila did post a couple of good ones. Or was it one?
Pretty much one.
Yeah, there was one. So key authors. Key authors I forgot to put a slide in for, but I can give you a bunch off the top of my head. Okay. So bone broth, let's get into that first. So I'd actually recently reached out to by these people, Bonafide Provisions. They sent me a sample of a bunch of their juices, which were absolutely disgusting. But moral of the story was they claim, bone broth has always great properties. I'd also heard it too sporadically. In all honesty, I never really looked into it. So I decided, since it gave me a couple hours notice, I decided to look into it on different medical journals and things like that. So Harvard did a study on it. It proved, they showed, and again, I don't know how accurate or not this is, but I saw pretty consistent consensus on this. Bone broth does not relieve joint pain, like is often said about it. It doesn't seem to make your skin any firmer or smoother, which is what a lot of people turn to it for. Yeah. Doesn't seem to improve digestion, and it doesn't strengthen bone. So that's according to a Harvard study. And like I said, I saw a bunch of others too that piggyback that. This is just kind of a summation. So that was one thing. Another thing to look out for is there's apparently a high risk of lead contamination in bone broth diets. Yeah. So basically the way that they process the broth, I don't exactly know how it works. I didn't look into it for that long, like I said, but apparently there's a processing mechanism wherein you have a much higher chance of having lead contamination. Obviously, we don't want that. They took it out of paint. We don't want that in our food. And then also there was another study from the 70s on bone broth. So this has gone back a long way. And this is from the National Institute of Health. And apparently they also found that it was even less nutritious than milk. So yeah, okay. So unfortunately, it seems like it's just a little bit of a fad. Fine. So if you didn't waste any money on it, good, don't.
I didn't. I just seen a lot of information about it, and I'm like, is this something I should be thinking about or not?
Yeah, and I know Dr. Axe, and I've looked at his stuff, and some of it's good. But when I looked at his bone broth stuff, he didn't cite any studies. He didn't cite anything really. So I'm just like, well, where is this information coming from? He's saying studies say this, and I don't believe it when people say that unless they link to it and I can verify it for myself. So I didn't see him cite anything. So I'm probably going to have to call BS on this, but again, I'm not 100% sure. But to my knowledge, from what I found in a couple of hours, there's not a lot proving that it does anything. In fact, quite the contrary. It's not a bad thing unless it's contaminated with lead, but it's not a great thing, like they're prescribing it to be. Cool. All right, and then good authors. So I know you're into this, and obviously we're going to be doing a book a month, so you guys are probably going to come across some of these authors. If you want to read other things on your own too, definitely feel more than welcome. So there is Nina Teicholz has really only written this book on nutrition that we're reading right now. There's Gary Taubes, and it depends on what you're into. I know, Lisa, you want more of a lifestyle book coming up next after we're done with this one. He is not that guy. He's more like her, but like 10 times more informative and thorough. So his books, like his first one that I read was like 1,000 pages. It took me 2 months to read. Like I even had trouble getting through it. And I find it really messed up how the government and everything, and these different researchers have really corrupted our diets. But yeah, when you see article after article, study after study presented, it's very dry. But if you're into that type of thing, like I can be sometimes, he's a good one. Dr. Davis, who wrote Wheat Belly on Doctor, is a good one. Dr. Mercola is a good one too. He has a health website. I mean, he just came out with a book recently called Fat for Fuel, which is a similar thing. That's one of the ones I'm debating to do next, because it is more lifestyle oriented, like how you can work this into your lifestyle, not just now, but in the future. There's another guy, Dr. Perlmutter, who wrote a book called Grain Brain, which is similar to Wheat Belly. And also he wrote another book called Brain Maker. And he talks about different types of foods and their positive impacts on the brain and your gut microbiome, which are obviously two crucial components to health. Let me think. There's other stuff. I'm kind of like a science geek, if you guys ever noticed, when I use studies and different things. So I like reading stuff like that. So there are researchers named Dr. Stephen Finney wrote a book about low carbohydrate living, basically the diet that I came up with the macronutrients and stuff that you guys are following. I kind of derived from him and his methods. And he actually has a book called The Art of Low Carbohydrate Living. So there is some science in it, but they also talk about how you can apply it to your everyday life. So off the top of my head, those are like half a dozen that you can look into. I can send a more thorough list into the group earlier. That was one slide I forgot to prepare for tonight. But does that answer your question, Sheila?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. All right, so any other questions on anything? It could be fasting, anything that's popped up in the last week that we have not really covered at length before we get into the book club stuff?
No.
Nope. All good? Okay. All right, so happy days. So first up, again, Michelle, I know you weren't here last week, so we're going to do a weekly discussion. It went much more than 10 minutes last week, but it was a good discussion. So we're doing chapters 4, 5, and 6 this week. So let's start off with chapter 4, which, Lisa, I'm sorry, that was a very, very bad chapter.
Holy crap, you're killing me with this.
Bad.
Yeah. Well, I hadn't read this book, so honestly, I didn't know what we were getting into. I saw her on the Joe Rogan podcast, and I thought, oh, that's cool. And I saw that it was shorter than some of Gary Taub's stuff, so I thought, okay, maybe this will be easier to digest. And it is, believe me. So in a way, I actually did you a service.
At least I wasn't nauseous this time, and there was no gross things I had to read about.
No, there wasn't my chapter, though, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. So let's talk about yours first. So the flawed science of saturated versus polyunsaturated fats. So a fun high school biology lesson for everybody today. So Lisa, let's break it down.
You have to remember, for 13 years, I was a health teacher. So reading all this stuff crushes me.
I know.
I mean, it's really, I
agree.
Wow. That's all I can say. I mean, I looked at the different studies, and they talked about that, his Jolliffe or whatever his name was. He was the New York City Health Department guy.
Yeah.
And he tested Key's work over a sustained period. And what really bugs me too, it's always men they're testing.
Yeah.
So that's one of my pet peeves right now. But basically, they reduced red meat to no more than 4 times a week. They consumed as much poultry and fish as they wanted. Eggs and dairy were limited, and they drank 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil daily. That was kind of gross.
Yeah.
The diet was 30% fat, and basically it was so flawed because the control group ate 40% fat, but no diet was ever recorded. And then the other piece of it is that you had people coming in and out of the study, and so they might have been in the study for a few days and dropped dead of a heart attack, but they were still counted. So, there was so many flaws in all of the studies. Basically, I thought, for me, one of the really interesting points was when they looked at the hydrogenated oils and the oils, like your margarines and your Crisco and all that stuff. And they started seeing such increases in cancer rates. I know all those oils, you're not supposed to do those, and the hydrogenated I've known for a long time. And now it's on food labels and everything. but still, they really don't connect it to the cancers. Like, that's not what you hear in the, everyday media.
Right.
So to me, that was really worrisome.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about that Finnish mental hospital, the mental hospital study, 6 years, and they swapped high vegetable fat, soy, polyunsaturated margarines, and that's really the one where they started to see that people were dying of the heart attacks, but they might have been admitted 3 days prior. So it's totally flawed and ridiculous. So I just kind of left feeling really like bummed out, like, oh my God, what did I teach all those years?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you certainly shouldn't blame yourself for that.
I know, but
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was a student not too long ago, scary enough, and I had a nutrition class in college. We were taught all the food pyramid was still around at that point. They've since changed it to my plate, and yeah, it's really terrible what they taught and in my chapter they go over that, how they completely threw everything on its head. So I always was led to believe that Keyes, and he kind of started it, he was hell-bent on proving his hypothesis and that saturated fat was the devil, but it was just saturated fat, and that you should eat more of the polyunsaturated fats that you were describing. And the diets, even the ones you mentioned in the chapter, was like 30-40% fat, somewhere in there, depending on which study you're talking about. And then they completely threw everything on its head, and that in the 1970s, they changed the dietary guidelines drastically. And there was a guy, Charles Percy, who was like one of the minority leaders in Congress at the time, who was completely against it because the science didn't really prove that you should be eating 55 to 60% of your dietary intake from carbohydrate. And the whole premise of, well, it's, we have this hypothesis and it's going to take way too long and cost too much to really do a detailed, thorough study. So let's make this guess and hope for the best, was kind of like what they did. And it's really screwed over a lot of people. So a lot of the things they look to avoid in heart disease, obesity, all these different issues that have continued to persist and even become worse throughout our population have continued. So it is really messed up, and it is very discouraging to look at and to think that, scientists could actually, go by that. I can understand kind of if you're in it at the time, you feel like you have this sense of responsibility to the public to try and really defend their health. But at the same time, if you have a hypothesis that's not well tested and not well proven, which it never was, I think it does a lot of people a lot of disservice. Was there anything else you wanted to add to your chapter that you took away from it or that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, well, just about how the American Heart Association also receives so much money and support from the food companies.
Mm-hmm.
Procter and Gamble,
Mm-hmm.
the Crisco and all that stuff. And that says a lot too.
Yeah.
I think that's life as we know it today in a lot of different areas.
Yeah. Back then it was kind of swept under the rug, and you didn't really, if you're a member of the public, you didn't really have a choice. You didn't really have much of a way to know unless you were directly involved in it. And yeah, it is very messed up. And that's kind of what my chapter talks about in chapter 5, which is a low fat goes to Washington. So when Washington got involved, that's when things really started getting dicey. So there was still some, what did I do here? Oops. Yeah. So there was still debate in the community. Obviously with the American Heart Association getting all this funding and Keyes and other researchers rising to prominence and shunning anybody who got in their way. Once Washington got involved, and once these major, corn and grain and sugar companies got involved in Washington, it was almost like game over. That's when the dietary guidelines started forming on the basis of a couple of extremely flawed studies. So there was that Seventh-day Adventist church study, and they were all vegetarians. And overall, apparently it showed that and there was also a nurses' health study. So there were two studies really that kind of had this same type of thing going on, where they had high compliance type of people, where if a doctor told them you have to take this medication, you have to make this lifestyle change, whatever, they complied more often than the average person. And so the author believes that there is some credence to the fact that, yeah, it's not only just the physical stuff you do, but also has to be your mental attitude. You have to be willing to want to improve your health and your situation. And that's a part of it too. And they believe that sometimes when they saw an association, but not a direct causation or correlation between red meat and heart disease and all these different things, that was really an issue. And the chapter also went into the fact that early Americans were actually healthier. Heart disease was virtually unknown to the public until the 1920s. They didn't even write about it in medical textbooks in this country until 1912. And we ate a lot of red meat. Apparently our farmers, they called them lazy, like they didn't really care about eating a lot of grains and crops and fruits and vegetables. We were heavy red meat eaters. We also ate all of the animal, which she went into explicit detail about again. So good thing you didn't get that chapter, Lisa. And yeah, and apparently, according to studies, I'm just pulling up a few of them here, we eat less than half the red meat now that we did back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Heart disease rates was rare before the 1920s. And yeah, once the Congress got involved, the USDA with biased researchers like Mark Hegstead got involved, it was game over. And even though there was some opposition to the drastic change in macronutrient ratios, where we should eat a high carbohydrate, very low fat diet, nobody seemed to care because, like you said, Lisa, and touched on in your chapter, it started to get politicized. And Washington, as the author went into in the chapter, is very, very slow to change. So once they make a change, it can take decades before they'll change anything, which is true. I think we all know that. And unfortunately, a lot of people, our parents, our grandparents, our elderly relatives who may or may not be with us anymore, have definitely suffered from that. Like I mentioned on last week's call, I have a cousin who died in his 30s of a heart attack. He didn't take care of himself. And there's so many people who are just misinformed because of these faulty dietary guidelines and that weren't well studied. And yeah, so that's essentially what the chapter was about. And I guess my main takeaway is that I didn't realize how politicized it was. When I read Gary Taub's books, it was much more so about there was politics involved, but it was more on the researcher side of like Ansel Keys and then some of his followers who seemed to dominate the space. But this book has gone more into the politics of it, and it's terrible how heavily involved these companies, who, knowing that their products hurt people, are paying millions and millions of dollars to members of Congress and to people in Washington to push their agenda across. And it's really been to the detriment of our health and our society.
Well, it's like Monsanto.
Mm-hmm.
They're
the biggest one, yeah. Like they know about, with their pesticides, which obviously they're involved with, and genetically modifying things when we don't know whether that's a good or a bad thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. For all we know, it's a good thing, and maybe that can save the lives of a lot of animals and save a lot of farmland that we can use in other means. But the fact that we are the guinea pigs, and it's just like, okay, we've developed this way of cultivating food, let's push it out, or we've developed this diet because we believe it might actually prevent heart disease or obesity, let's push this out to the public and see what happens. I think it's a terrible means of going about it, and I'd rather do a longer term study on people and really trying to create direct causation before saying definitively and pushing it out into the press. And that was the last thing that this chapter talked about too, was that once the press got a hold of this stuff, they sensationalized it. There's that famous Time magazine cover with the two eggs as eyes and the bacon frown, telling you that you can't eat fat and cholesterol. And sensationalizing it, obviously, you put fear into the public. And I remember early on, whether it was in our beta program and working with any of my clients, when I recommend the type of diet that I recommend, they have so much trepidation because for their entire lives, they were taught, eat low fat, eat high protein, eat high carb. And it's wrong. It's complete reverse of what you should be doing, what we had been doing prior to the increase in heart disease. And it's really a shame that greed and corporate interests got involved when it was initially just some stubborn scientists who were unwilling to relent on their hypothesis. So that was my take on chapter 5. Did anyone want to add anything in?
No.
Nope. All good. Alrighty then. So moving on to chapter 6, Sheila, how women and children fare on a low-fat diet. So Lisa, I know you mentioned that you were not thrilled with how a lot of these studies are pretty much all about men and how they fare. And it turns out that women and children seem to need more fat. So Sheila, tell us a little bit more about what that chapter goes into.
After reading this, I feel like a terrible parent.
You didn't know, so don't feel bad about it.
Gosh. So they talk about the dietary guidelines and how it became the diet of the entire nation. And then they got into choosing snacks from other food groups. And I love this line. It said, in short, to avoid fat, people should eat sugar, was pretty much what they were telling us to do. Mm-hmm. And we became the snack wells phenomenon of all the refined carbohydrates. And I thought that was like, wow. They did talk about that. They did a survey with women that actually, or not a survey, but a test that was the largest and longest trial of the low-fat diet to ever be undertaken. And it just really showed that it does not work. Mm-hmm. And that was with women. So, and it had, what it did is it actually, I mean, yes, it lowered, reduced their overall fat from 37% to 29% of calories, and their saturated fat from 12.4% to 9.5%. But they were no less likely than the control group to get breast cancer or other types of cancers or stroke or even heart disease. And they only lost 1 pound more than the control group. So they pretty much showed that low-fat diets do not work for women. But the other thing that they were talking a lot about is how, with this whole low-fat diet, how we just made things really bad for our kids. We took away whole milk and, went to skim or 1%, and how, just the whole idea that we were totally taking away so much of the fat that our kids need because we thought it was bad for them. And one of the things too they talked about was they did identify that there were the 2 different types of cholesterols, the HDL and the LDL. But it found that what really could make a difference was, we know that HDL is supposed to be good, but that's where you're going to make the biggest changes. But the drug industry couldn't find or create a drug to help that. So they focused more on the LDLs, and they made a lot of attempts. They tried to find things that would raise the HDL, but it wouldn't work. So that's why they were pushing for the LDL. So it was the drug companies that were behind that whole thing. It was just really kind of almost depressing.
No, yeah, absolutely.
But the biggest study was by women. And also the other thing too is that so many of the researchers were saying that we need to get kids right away on low-fat diets, and where they found that is not true. That the people that were on more vegetarian diets or diets that were low in fat did not grow at the same level. They did not develop at the same level as those that had a higher fat diet.
Right.
And so I'm like, maybe my daughter would be taller than me if I would have given her more fat.
It's possible. Maybe I would have played in the NBA if my parents gave me more. Who knows?
I know. So, yeah. So those are the main highlights.
No, yeah, absolutely. And there was actually a study that I forgot to mention in chapter 5 too, about from the nurses study, and they saw that there was an increased risk in endometrial cancer for women who ate more of a vegetarian diet, which was crazy.
Oh, I know.
So clearly it's different between the genders, certainly, but overall, yeah, it has led to a lot of issues. I mean, we're seeing a lot of issues with children. I won't get into all that. That probably weren't evident when you guys were growing up, or even when I was growing up. You know, the prevalence of autism and different things that were just were virtually unheard of. But yeah, I think that it's just like we've been talking about, and I'm sure it's going to be a recurring theme as we continue with this book. We've unfortunately been set up for failure. It was based off a faulty hypothesis that then became the law of the land, thanks to both political and corporate interests. And I honestly, it's a good thing that there are voices out there that are finding this information and putting it together so that people can read it and better understand it, like what we're doing right now. But I don't remember, or I don't think I've ever seen a mainstream media news outlet or even a show really go into detail and take this type of thing seriously. I did see on, I think it was the Dr. Phil show once, he had a keto person on, but he was very skeptical. And I think just the way that he approached it on air and with his audience, I think it kind of nullified any of the positive stuff that could have come out of the guy who was on the show. So yeah, I think, unfortunately for now, until things really change, and I don't foresee them changing too much in the near future, I think we all need to be very, very cautious when we see a news article, when we see a news segment, when someone tells us that a certain diet or a certain thing is good. I think it's important to do our research before we really give it any credence. And just like with the bone broth thing at the beginning, you're hearing from someone who's usually reputable, and then there's really no science to back it up, and he doesn't use any science to back up his claims. So it's very important to keep one eye open at all times. It's kind of sad that we've gotten to that point, but once corporate interests and politics get involved, it's very tough to understand who's right, who's wrong, and who's telling the truth and who's not. So,
and it's just frustrating. I mean, I could find information on anything, whether it's plant-based diet, vegan diet. I mean, I've tried them all, and I mean, you just don't know what to believe anymore. There's just too many, different points of view out there. It seems to be scientifically, backed and everything, but you just don't know. I mean, like all those lies that are, woven into the research that they're doing and using. It's so frustrating.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And even when you read studies, like even when I read studies, I look at who funded the study, who did the study, do they have any ties? And sometimes it's almost like, you're a detective and you got one of those visual boards where you're like, all right, this is suspect A, and we're trying to track like where their connection to the case may be coming from. And sometimes you have to dig like 6 feet under to finally get out the dirt. It's insane. The lengths you have to go to see if something is reputable or not. And even then, you can't be 100% certain. So, yeah, it's definitely eye-opening, but it is good that people like the author of this book and others out there are getting the information out. They're doing the research for us. They're presenting it to us. So obviously, sometimes, especially the last few chapters, not been very easy to digest, but it's all pretty cohesive and pretty easy to see what's going on. Any last comments about what we read this week before we move forward?
No.
All good? All right. Yep. So next week we will continue. Jesus, I need to fix that. So Lisa, chapter 7, Michelle, chapter 8, Sheila, chapter 9, Monica, if you see that, chapter 10. Otherwise, Daddy's on deck again, and we'll go from there. All right. Any final questions, comments, concerns before we finish up for the night and week with the call?
I have that one about coffee. How much sugar is okay to have in that morning time? 1 packet's okay. How many times?
All right, so we're talking about sugar.
Well, not sugar. It's the sweetener. But like how many many cups would you say is safe to do without me spiking an insulin level?
How many cups of coffee?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm
So
putting one one Splenda packet in a coffee.
okay. Well, yeah, definitely listen to your doctor. I wouldn't do Splenda because that will spike it. In terms of coffee, coffee does elicit an insulin response. Anytime you ingest anything that's not water, you will elicit an insulin response. Up until about 50 calories really seems to be the point where you're taking yourself out of that fasted state. So since each cup of coffee is about 5 calories, you can have an insane amount before you actually do anything. If you're having a non-caloric and non-insulin spiking sweetener like a stevia, like monk fruit, maybe like Swerve, Lisa, obviously try it in a separate place before you do it. I think you guys will, I think you'll be fine. So I personally have like 2 or 3 before I eat every day with a packet of
you
Splenda.
do?
Yeah, I do.
With the what do you use?
I use stevia. So I have like a packet of stevia. Yeah.
Yep.
If I said Splenda, I apologize. I would never.
Yeah.
Any other questions about anything?
No,
Nope.
but what are we supposed to do? How many hours now?
Okay. So now this week we're doing 8 hours. So 8-hour window. So the first 2 weeks was a 10-hour window. Now we're doing an 8-hour window.
Jeez. Does that start tomorrow?
That starts tomorrow. Yeah,
Hey,
today.
okay.
If you didn't do that, that's okay. We're starting that tomorrow for the next couple of weeks, and then the challenge is over. And then you guys can decide whether or not you ever want to do that again. Sounds like probably not. But maybe after the video in the group, maybe we will.
Yeah. 8 is hard, I think, though. For me, anyway. Harder.
8?
Yeah.
Oh my God! So I did all this wrong.
Oh, you already did 8?
I've been doing 8 the whole time. Thinking we were going
There you
down
go.
to 6.
All right, so you got a leg up on them then. You've already been doing it. They have to adjust. You don't.
I can't even believe this. So I don't even have to go into my panic about coffees. I'm going to be fine. Never mind. Erase everything.
All right. Never happened. All right, good.
Holy cow.
Yeah, I was actually about to say, I thought you had been doing 8, like just based on your posts. I could have sworn it added up to
I
8.
was doing it. I thought we were going to 6 hours.
So you're fine. Just don't do 6. I mean, you can if you want, but I'm keeping it at 8. So if you want to stay at 8, stay at 8. 2 more weeks of it, and then you can make a decision based on how you're feeling and what you want to do.
Okay.
All right. Any last questions, comments, concerns?
Nope.
Yeah.
No.
All right. Well, that's it, guys. So good night. Good call this week. So you guys have your chapters. Obviously, let me know if you need me to pinch hit again. I hope I don't. Otherwise, have a good night. We'll be in touch. We'll be in touch in the group, and yeah, just keep rocking. You guys are doing well.
Okay.
Have a
Thank you.
good night.
Good
All
night.
right. Good night.
Night.
Bye-bye.